Welcome back to our discussion on parallel structure. We've spent the first two videos really discussing what parallel structure is and how to make sure our sentences are structured in a parallel manner at the very base level, making sure that our nouns are matched up with nouns, our verbs are matched up with our verbs, and that our phrases are matched up with our phrases. For the rest of this video, I really want to focus on to make our sentences parallel from a more holistic kind of way. Holistic meaning overall or um, all together kind of manner. In this way, now that we've gotten the pieces of the puzzle together, now we're putting the puzzle together, if you will. And the first of these is by making sure that all of our pairs and lists are parallel. When you have items in a series, we've talked about how you have item 1, item 2, and item 3. Of course, you remember all of this discussion because we had the great Oxford Comma discussion and why I really suggest using it, why most of your style guides will say either use it or it's optional, and in that regard, I would highly recommend going ahead and using it. Well, do you remember all of these things? Now we're going to talk about the actual items themselves and how to make sure that they are written correctly and not worrying about our commas because we know how to use commas at this point. When you write items in a series, you want to make sure that all of the items follow a similar form because all of these items could be nouns or verbs or phrases. For example, in your book, we might have the example, the professor assigned, and we can assume that this is our stem. The professor assigned readings, practices to do, and a paper. Now, let's discuss what this looks like. Let's discuss the sentence and kind of break down this sentence. The professor assigned. Alright, probably going to be our stem. We might even want to start with the professor because we don't necessarily know what it is that we're making parallel. So we're not quite sure about assigned, but once we read readings, practices to do in a paper, then we can safely assume that the assigned is going to be part of our stem right here, so we're good to go. Readings. Alright. Practices to do. Okay. And a paper. Alright. So take a second. What do you think will need to be editing? What is it that you think needs to be fixed? And how do you think we'll go about fixing it? Well, if we think about what our items are, here in readings we just have the one item. Readings is acting as a collective noun in this case. Discussed in Tuesday's lesson, collective nouns act as one singular unit. And so for the purpose of what's going on here, this is all considered one item, right? Now, if we skip over practices to do, paper is also one item. And even practices, though this is clearly not just one item, right? We might have 2 or 3 homework assignments and it's not set up as a collective noun. It could be written as just one item in this list. However, the fact that we have this phrase to do throws off the structure of our sentence. Therefore, the way that we need to fix this is a very simple fix. The professor assigned readings, practices, and a paper. We just drop the to do. Because here's the ultimate understanding and realization about this particular example sentence. All of these are things that the student would need to do. The professor assigned readings to do, practices to do, and a paper to do or to write. Right? These are all things that our professor is expecting us to do. Therefore, we can get rid of it completely because it's understood. And if we wanted to include all three of them, that would be fine. It would make the sentence wordy, and we don't want to make sentences unnecessarily wordy. But by all means, assigned readings, practices, and a paper, all of these things are things that it's expected that the students do. And so to have it written out right here is wordy, unnecessary, and it makes the sentence not parallel. Another way that you can make a sentence parallel as far as pairs and lists are concerned goes back to our prepositional phrases. Another example in your book reads, the story was in the newspaper, on the radio, and the television. Now, let's look at our phrases in this sentence. In the newspaper, on the radio, and the television. Well, here we have a prepositional phrase, and here we have a prepositional phrase, but we don't have a prepositional phrase here. On top of that, this prepositional phrase and this prepositional phrase do not match up. So what do? How do we fix this? How do we get around this? Well, it's actually very simple. As we remember from our last discussion about phrases and how to make them parallel, then we remember that our prepositional phrases don't have to be the same. In the newspaper and on the radio are parallel prepositional phrases by the simple nature of both of them are prepositional phrases. So these are perfectly fine, and we actually don't have to worry about these at all. Our only problem phrase is the television. But I'm sure at this point you can figure out, the easiest way to make this sentence parallel. The story was in the newspaper, on the radio, and on the television. Exactly, right. All we have to do to make this sentence parallel, is to introduce another prepositional sentence. On the television. Now, some of you might be thinking, and understandably so, that another way that we could change this is to shift our preposition to the beginning. But remember, we can only do that. We can only make the preposition part of the stem if all of them match up. So we can't just say the story was on the newspaper, the radio, and the television. We can't say that because our prepositions don't match up. Furthermore, it might be tempting, because 2 out of 3 are on the radio, to just write the story was on the newspaper, the radio, and the television. Television. However, the issue with that comes with how we speak normally and appropriate word use, and on the newspaper is not a phrase that we use. We don't say something is on a newspaper. We only say that it's in a newspaper. So unfortunately, this is the only workaround for this particular sentence, is to introduce this phrase on the television, because we don't say that things are on a newspaper, and therefore we can't just write the story was on the newspaper, the radio, and the television. We're going to have to expand the prepositional phrases in order to make the sentence parallel. We don't really have another choice for this sentence, unfortunately. I want to give you another example that is in your textbook. And again, some of you don't have your textbook. That's perfectly fine and valid. We are working on ways to get around that and to figure that out. But for the time being, here is an example from practice 24-1 in your textbook. This is number 4, and I really like the way that number 4 is set up and the way to fix number 4. For context, practice 24-1 is talking about coyotes in the surrounding area. And so this sentence is, coyotes are sometimes vegetarians, sometimes scavengers, and sometimes, they hunt. Now, I want you to take a second, pause the video if you need to, and decide how we are going to make this sentence parallel. Alright, so again, I'm assuming that you've paused the video and you are ready to proceed and match up how you have made this sentence parallel. Your answers might vary a little bit, but as far as simplicity's sake is concerned, your answer will probably be coyotes are sometimes vegetarians, sometimes scavengers, and sometimes hunters. Instead of saying they hunt, you just turn this phrase into its noun form. Hunters. You might also, again for simplicity's sake, write or have written coyotes are sometimes vegetarians, scavengers, and hunters. Now between the two, I personally like this method of solving number 4 and having the sometimes right there in each case, because it introduces and it makes sure that you're telling your readers that in one case they might be this, in another case they might be this, and in another case they might be this. However, grammatically, there's nothing wrong with saying sometimes this, this, and this. But that was just one example of parallel structures and pairs and lists from your book that I really appreciated and that I really liked. I also want to do number 5 with you really quick. I really like the way that number 5 is set up as well. So let us bump up the font size. Number 5. Today, they, the coyotes, are spreading and populate the East Coast for the first time. Well, again, it's simple. Sometimes, they're spreading and, they populate the East Coast. But as I'm sure you can tell just with me typing it out and reading it, perhaps for the first time, there's no way that this one is parallel structure. So once again, take a second, pause the video if you need to, and let's come back together and decide how we want to make this parallel. Once again, I'm assuming that you have come up and are ready to discuss how to solve this sentence. Again, a couple of different ways that you might have solved it for simplicity's sake. You might have just written today, they are spreading and populating the East Coast for the first time. Again, this is a case of our verbs matching up with our verbs. We have a progressive verb, they are spreading, they are doing this thing, and we have the understood are populating, but because R applies to both, we can make R part of the stem. They are spreading and populating the East Coast. Now, again, we'll have one more video. We will wrap up parallel structure and take care of some housekeeping things in the last video.